They say your gut always knows when something is wrong, even before your mind catches up. I didn't want to believe that when I opened Emily's apartment door, but the silence waiting for me inside wouldn't let me ignore it. Her things were scattered across the small living room, the same as always, shoes kicked off by the couch, a mug half empty on the coffee table, but it all felt frozen, like someone had hit pause and walked away without unpausing it. The door was unlocked when I arrived. That was the first sign because Emily was otherwise meticulous about locking up. I stepped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The air was stale, heavy in a way I couldn't place, and every step forward made the space feel smaller. Her keys were still on the counter by the sink, where she always left them. Her phone was on the kitchen table, screen dark, charging cord dangling off the edge. I picked it up and pressed the button, but the screen stayed black. That's when I glanced around the apartment again to look for her jacket, her shoes, something to suggest she'd just stepped out and would be back any second. But the more I searched, the more I realized she wasn't coming back. I checked the bedroom next, though my legs didn't want to take me there. The bed was unmade, her comforter pulled halfway to the floor like she'd gotten up in a hurry. Her closet door hung open, and I scanned the rows of clothes. 5 dresses, 2 coats, 4 empty hangers. I reached for one of the hangers, brushing the cool metal with my fingers, and froze. Something was crumpled at the back of the closet, wedged between the baseboard and the wall. I crouched, pulled it free, and unfolded the piece of paper. The writing looked as if someone had scrawled it in a hurry. It wasn't long, just 2 sentences, but I read it 3 times before it sank in. Wait for the right moment. Kill them when they're alone. My stomach twisted. The note wasn't in Emily's handwriting, but finding it, in her closet specifically, made my mind race in 1,000 directions at once. All I could think was, who wrote this? Is it for her, or is it about her? No matter how long I stared at it, I couldn't make sense of it. I searched the rest of the apartment with shaking hands, rifling through drawers and overturning cushions, but there was nothing else. No explanation, no clue. The entire place was frozen, just like I'd found it. As I stood in the middle of her living room, clutching the note, I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the hum of the fridge, not the faint city noise from the window. The silence was absolute. I told myself to call someone, to call anyone, but my feet didn't move. I kept staring at the note like it would change by reading it enough times. By the time I left the apartment, the sun was dipping below the skyline, and the shadows outside stretched farther than normal. I locked the door behind me, even though I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had happened in that apartment, the lock wouldn't stop it. I stuffed the note into my pocket and walked home, but the words followed me. Kill them when they're alone. And whoever had written it wasn't finished yet. The note burned in my pocket the entire walk home. Every step felt heavier, as if the words dug themselves into my skin. I kept my eyes forward and tried to focus on the rhythm of my steps, but the silence around me felt as if the city itself was holding its breath. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and slid the chain into place. It didn't feel like enough. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lock, before stepping into the living room. My phone sat on the coffee table, and its screen glowed faintly with a notification, but I ignored it. I pulled the note from my pocket and unfolded it again. The paper was thin, soft at the edges, and the jagged letters seemed to stare back at me. I set it on the table and paced the room. My mind spun with more questions I couldn't answer. Who wrote it? Why has it been hidden in Emily's closet? I stopped by the window and stared at the darkened street below. A car idled at the curb for a moment before pulling away, its headlights sweeping across the empty road. For a brief second, the world felt distant, like I was watching it from somewhere else. Emily's face flashed in my mind with her sharp smile and the way her laugh filled a room. It didn't make sense for her to just vanish. I shook my head and sat on the couch after grabbing my laptop. Her social media was the first place I looked. Her last post was a photo of her standing in the park, taken a few days ago. She wore her favorite frayed scarf, and leaves scattered on the path behind her glowed gold in the sunlight. She looked happy. I stared at the photo for so long, searching for something that wasn't there. The next photo on her feed was different. It wasn't of her. It was the same park, the same path, but this time, there was a man standing just at the edge of the frame. He wasn't facing the camera. His back was turned, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he didn't want to be seen. The caption read, "The strangest things always happen here." I clicked through the rest of her photos, but the man didn't appear again. My stomach twisted as I went back to that one image, zooming in on the blurred figure. Something about his posture made me uneasy. I couldn't explain why. I moved to her messages next. The most recent were from me, our plans for the weekend. Above those was a message from someone I didn't recognize, a single letter as a username and no profile picture. "We need to meet." I stared at the screen, my hands cold against the laptop. I checked the time on the message. It had been sent 3 days prior, the same day as the photo in the park. I clicked on the username, but the account was gone. There was nothing left, no history, no trace. The silence in the room grew heavier. I closed the laptop and glanced at the note on the table. It hadn't changed, but it felt different, as if it was daring me to figure out its meaning. I picked it up again, running my fingers along the torn edge. It must have come from somewhere, but there was no clue on the paper itself. I stood and paced again, my bare feet brushing against the rough carpet. The note felt heavier in my hand, as if it were alive. I turned it over, but the back was blank, smooth, and unremarkable. I thought about calling someone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something I needed to figure out on my own. Emily had trusted me, and I wasn't going to let her down. I walked back to the living room and set the note down again, this time tucking it under the laptop. My eyes drifted to the window, and I froze. The street below was empty, except for a single figure standing under a streetlight. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but they were facing my building, completely still. I didn't move. My chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths as I waited for them to do something, anything, but they didn't. They just stood there, motionless, like a statue waiting to come to life. I took a step back from the window, my hands gripping the edge of the couch. When I looked again, the street was empty. The light flickered once before going out. I stood there in the silence, staring at the darkness outside. The note and the message on Emily's account ran through my mind, their meanings twisting and tangling into something I couldn't untangle. The only thing I knew for certain was that someone was watching, and they weren't going to stop. The apartment felt as if it were closing in on me after what I'd seen. I paced from the kitchen to the living room, glancing at the window every few steps, expecting the figure to return. My thoughts circled the same points: Emily's disappearance, the cryptic note, and that shadowy figure on the street. The connection between them was just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that wouldn't come. I needed answers, and everything pointed back to the message in Emily's account. Whoever had sent it had to know something. I searched the username again, hoping I'd missed something the first time, but the account was gone. Frustration clawed at me, and I closed the laptop harder than I meant to. The note was still tucked beneath it, the edges of the paper frayed and curling. It didn't feel like a clue anymore. It felt like a threat. I turned my attention back to the photo of Emily in the park, the one with the man in the background. I studied his posture, the angle of his head, the way he stood just outside the frame. His presence felt deliberate. He wasn't just passing by. He was there for a reason. I grabbed my jacket and left the apartment, locking the door twice before stepping into the hallway. The air outside felt sharp against my skin, and the street was quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. I made my way to the park, keeping my hands in my pockets and my head down. The streetlights above me buzzed faintly, their glow reflecting off the damp pavement. The park wasn't far. When I reached it, the path stretched out before me like a scar in the grass. The trees on either side loomed closer than I remembered, their bare branches tangled against the sky. I walked slowly, scanning the benches and shadows for something, anything, that might explain why Emily had been here. Halfway down the path, I found it. A single white sneaker lay on its side, streaked with mud. It was small, just like the ones Emily always wore. My chest tightened, and I crouched to pick it up, brushing dirt off the laces. It was hers. I knew it was hers. I stood quickly and glanced around the clearing, my pulse hammering in my ears. The park was empty, but it didn't feel empty. The trees seemed closer, their twisted shapes pressing in from the edges of my vision. I turned toward the path and started walking, clutching the sneaker like it was an anchor. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as I made my way back to the street. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following, but the path remained empty. When I finally stepped back onto the sidewalk, I exhaled sharply and turned toward home. Back in my apartment, I set the sneaker on the table next to the note. The two objects stared back at me, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I rubbed my hands over my face and sat on the couch, staring at the faint glow of the laptop. The photo with the man's blurry figure nagged at me. He had to be part of this. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the image again, zooming in on the man until his outline filled the screen. Something about the way he stood felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. I scrolled through the comments beneath the post, looking for any mention of him, but most were from friends laughing about the caption. Then I saw it, a single comment from an account with no profile picture. He's watching. My hands tightened around the phone as I stared at the words. The account name was just one letter, E. My chest felt hollow as I clicked the username, hoping for some clue, but the profile was gone. There wasn't even an error message. It was as if the account had never existed. I stood and began pacing again, glancing at the sneaker on the table every few steps. The silence in the apartment pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I stopped by the window, looking out into the street below. A car sat idling near the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I watched it for a moment, waiting for it to move, but it didn't. Something about the stillness made my stomach twist. The driver's seat was empty. The lights flicked off suddenly, leaving the street in shadows. My breath caught as I stepped back from the window. The car didn't move. It sat there, silent and dark, as if waiting for me to make the next move. Unable to look at it any longer, I turned away from the window. The sneaker and the note sat side by side on the table, mocking me with their unanswered questions. My thoughts raced in circles, each one darker than the last. Emily's face flashed in my mind again, her wide smile and bright eyes. and I clenched my fists against the memory. The screen of my laptop lit up suddenly, breaking the silence. A single notification appeared, an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Don't look back." I stared at the words, my chest tightening with a cold, sinking dread. Before I could open it, the power in the apartment flickered, plunging the room into darkness. My heart hammered as I stood there, the glow from my phone the only light left. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. And then, for the first time all night, I wasn't sure I was alone. The silence in the apartment was absolute. I stayed rooted to the spot, clutching my phone in one hand, the faint glow from the screen the only light in the room. My eyes darted toward the window, but I didn't dare step closer. The car outside remained in shadow, unmoving. A soft thud echoed through the building. My grip on the phone tightened as I strained to listen, but the sound didn't repeat. My legs felt stiff as I forced myself to move, heading for the kitchen. I needed the illusion of action, even if I didn't know what I was doing. The cold tile beneath my feet grounded me for a moment, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier. I placed the phone on the counter and opened the fridge, letting the light spill into the room. Something caught my eye near just outside of the kitchen, a faint smudge on the floorboards in the doorway. I crouched, my fingers hovering over the dark streak. It wasn't dirt or dust. It looked like something had been dragged. My chest tightened as I followed the streak toward the fridge. It stopped abruptly, disappearing into nothing. I opened the fridge door and scanned the shelves, expecting something to leap out at me. There was nothing out of place. I shut it quickly and leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. The stark contrast only made the rest of the apartment feel darker. My stomach churned as I leaned on the counter, staring into the faint reflection on the metal handle of the freezer. It didn't feel safe anymore, but I had nowhere else to go. The email notification burned in the back of my mind. I picked up the phone again and stared at the subject line. "Don't look back." I opened the message. The body of the email was blank. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then I noticed the attachment. It was a single image file, no name, just a string of numbers. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity won out. The photo filled the screen. It was my apartment. The picture showed the view from the living room window, taken from outside on the street. The curtains were open, revealing the faint outline of someone standing inside. It was me. My throat tightened as I stared at the image, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. The angle was perfect, the lighting unmistakable. Someone had been watching me, standing in the same spot of the idling car. I turned toward the window, expecting to see a figure staring back, but the street outside was empty. My chest rose and fell in quick bursts, the weight of the photo pressing down on me. I looked back at the phone, but the screen was already dark, as though the message had been wiped clean. The sneaker and the note sat on the table like artifacts from a crime scene. I couldn't ignore the connections anymore. Emily's disappearance, the man in the photo, the cryptic messages, all pointed to something bigger than me. I picked up the sneaker, running my fingers along the muddy sole, and turned the note over again. The words were the same, sharp and direct. Wait for the right moment. Kill them when they're alone. The meaning gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. Kill who? What the hell is going on? My laptop flickered back to life on the table, breaking the silence. A new window opened on its own, a black screen with white text flashing in uneven bursts. At first it looked like gibberish, but as the symbols settled, a single line appeared. "It's your turn now." The message flashed over and over until the screen was filled with the same phrase. My hands shook as I closed the laptop, but the words were burned into my mind. I grabbed the sneaker and the note, shoved them into a bag without thinking, and threw on my jacket. The hallway outside my apartment felt colder. My footsteps echoed faintly against the walls, but they sounded like they buzzed with every step. The elevator button glowed faintly as I pressed it, the hum of the machinery louder than I remembered. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the ground floor button. I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls, my own face looking back with eyes that didn't seem quite right. The hum of the elevator grew louder, deeper, until it sounded like a growl beneath my feet. The doors slid open, and I stepped into the lobby. The path stretched out before me, darker than before, and the faint outline of a figure appeared in the distance. My chest tightened as I slowed my steps and locked my eyes on the figure. They stood perfectly still, their face turned away, their posture eerily familiar. My grip on the bag tightened as I inched closer, but they didn't move. The silence pressed down on me, wrapping around my throat like a noose. When I was close enough to see their outline clearly, I stopped. The figure turned, but their face wasn't there. The shape was empty, a shadow without detail, and the edges of their form blurred as if the air itself was rejecting them. My legs refused to move as the figure raised an arm, pointing toward me. A single thought burned in my mind. You shouldn't have come back. The bag slipped from my hand, and the sneaker tumbled onto the path as the figure stepped closer. I turned and ran. By the time I reached the street, the figure was gone, but the weight of their presence lingered. I stopped under a streetlight, my chest heaving, and looked back toward the park. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving, but the darkness beneath them felt alive. In the corner of my eye, a car door opened. The door to the car creaked open, the sound cutting through the quiet like a sharp breath. I froze beneath the streetlight, my gaze locked on the shifting shadow near the car. A figure stepped out slowly, their movements deliberate, as if they wanted me to see them. They stood still for a moment, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. Then they turned and walked down the street, and their silhouette faded into darkness. I stayed where I was, the cold air biting at my skin, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct told me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I turned toward the park again. It loomed in front of me, the trees like jagged teeth cutting into the night sky. The bag at my feet seemed to hum with its own weight, the sneaker poking out like an accusing finger. I forced myself to pick it up and started walking, my steps uneven as I retraced my path. Each crunch of gravel beneath my shoes pulsed in my eardrums. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, a scent that stuck in my throat. When I reached my apartment, the hallway seemed darker than before. The light above my door flickered weakly, casting the space in uneven flashes. I unlocked the door quickly and stepped inside, shutting it behind me with more force than I intended. The lock clicked into place, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. The laptop sat where I had left it, closed but still faintly glowing along the edges. I placed the bag on the table and slumped onto the chair as I gripped its sides to steady my breathing. The note slipped out of the bag and landed on the table, the words staring up at me like a dare. Wait for the right moment. Kill them when they're alone. I tore my eyes away from the note and opened the laptop again. The black window from before was still open, the repeated phrase filling the screen. It's your turn now. I tried closing the window, but it reopened almost immediately, the same words flashing across the screen. A new line of text appeared, standing out against the repeated phrase, "See you there." The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. Before I could think, an address appeared beneath the message. I recognized it immediately. It was near the park. The room felt smaller as I stood, the walls pressing in on me. The air tasted stale, and the faint hum from the fridge grew louder. I grabbed the bag and my jacket, my movements mechanical, as if something else were controlling me. My mind screamed at me to stop, to throw the laptop out the window and forget all of this, but my body moved on autopilot. The streets were empty as I made my way back to the park. The address wasn't far, just a few blocks past the trees. The houses in this part of town were older, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The silence grew thicker with every step, and the weight of the bag in my hand seemed to pull me forward. When I reached the house, it stood out like a wound in the night. The shutters hung crooked, and the paint peeled in long strips, exposing dark wood underneath. The porch sagged under its own weight, and the windows reflected nothing but darkness. My hand shook as I reached for the gate, the rusted metal cold against my skin. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. I hesitated on the porch, my breath catching as I stared into the void beyond the doorway. The air smelled stronger here, metallic and damp, like wet iron and rotting leaves. My fingers brushed the edge of the door, pushing it open slowly. The house swallowed the light from the street, leaving me in a void. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I stepped inside. The bag slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. I froze, listening, but the house didn't react. I moved further into the house, my eyes adjusting to the faint light filtering through a cracked window. The walls were lined with old photographs, their frames tilted and dusty. I stepped closer to one, the image of a young woman smiling brightly. Her face seemed familiar, but I couldn't place her. Beneath the frame, faint scratches carved into the wall caught my attention. The words were crude but legible. "I have her." My chest tightened as I turned away from the wall, my eyes darting toward the hallway ahead. The darkness at the end of the corridor felt alive, shifting with something I couldn't see. I took another step forward, the floor groaning beneath me. My hand brushed against the bag, and the sneaker tumbled out, landing with a soft thud on the floor. Something moved. It wasn't loud, just a subtle shift of air, but it stopped me in my tracks. The faint metallic scent grew stronger, coating my tongue. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I stared into the hallway of pulsing shadows. A faint glow appeared ahead, a single light flickering weakly at the end of the corridor. I stepped toward it, each movement slow and deliberate. My body felt heavy, as if the air itself was pulling me back. The light revealed an open door, its frame jagged and splintered. I hesitated in front of the doorway, my chest tight as I stared into the room beyond. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects, shoes, books, photographs. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a single photo at the center of the wall. It was Emily. Her eyes stared back at me, but the smile I remembered was gone. Something shifted behind me, and the door slammed shut. The sound resembled a gunshot in the quiet. I turned sharply, my breath catching, but there was nothing there. The walls seemed to pulse, the faint light in the room flickering with a rhythm that didn't match the hum of the bulb. My chest tightened as I stepped back, my foot hitting the bag on the floor. Emily's photograph stared down at me from the wall, her face frozen in an expression I didn't recognize. Her eyes were wide, and her lips were pressed into a thin line that hinted at something more than fear. The shelves around her picture held personal objects, worn notebooks, scratched jewelry, mismatched shoes. My gaze settled on a familiar scarf hanging limply over a hook, the edges frayed. It was hers. I moved closer to the wall, my hand brushing against the surface as I reached for the photograph. The frame was cold, and the glass was smudged with faint fingerprints. The longer I looked at the image, the more I noticed things that didn't belong. The background behind Emily was warped and unnatural. Shapes loomed behind her, blurred like a memory that refused to come into focus. The floor creaked behind me. I froze, my hand still on the frame. The room's air grew heavier, the metallic scent sharp enough to sting my throat. My eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to move independently of the faint light. Something shifted just beyond my sight, but I didn't dare turn fully toward it. A noise broke the silence, a soft, wet sound, like something dragging across the floor. My fingers tightened on the frame as I backed toward the door, my steps slow and deliberate. The dragging grew louder, and the shadows in the corner stretched toward me, their edges fraying like smoke caught in the wind. I reached for the doorknob, but it didn't turn. My grip tightened as I twisted harder, but it stayed locked, unyielding. The air behind me shifted, pressing against my back like a weight I couldn't shake. I glanced over my shoulder, and the shadows solidified into a shape, a figure, hunched and featureless, with no face but eyes that burned with something I couldn't name. My chest felt like it might collapse under the weight of its gaze. It moved closer, and the dragging sound merged with the creaking floorboards. My legs refused to move, my body rooted to the spot as the thing reached for me, its arms stretching unnaturally long. The smell of iron was overwhelming, filling my nose and coating my tongue. The photograph slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. The sound jolted me into motion, and I stumbled back toward the shelves. My hand brushed against something cold and sharp, and I grabbed it instinctively, a long piece of jagged metal. It was heavy and uneven, but it gave me a sense of control. The figure stopped, its head tilting as if it were studying me. I raised the metal in front of me, my hands trembling. The light flickered again, and for a moment the room was bathed in shadow. When the light returned, the figure was closer, its form sharper, more human, but not at the same time. A voice, low and hollow, filled the space around me. It wasn't a sound, it was a pressure, a force that settled in my chest and pushed against my ribs. "You know what you've done," it said. The words ripped through my mind, and flashes of Emily's face came with them, her wide eyes, her outstretched hand, the way she had screamed my name. My knees buckled as the memories flooded back, vivid and undeniable. I hadn't forgotten what had happened. I had buried it. I stumbled forward, the metal falling from my grip as I clutched my head. The room shifted around me, the shelves warping and twisting like they were alive. The objects on them blurred, but the photograph of Emily stayed sharp, her eyes burning into mine. The walls seemed to whisper, their voices overlapping in an unfamiliar language. The truth was impossible to ignore. I had brought her here. I had pushed her. The memory was jagged, broken into pieces I couldn't fully connect. But she had trusted me, and I had betrayed her. The figure stepped closer, its presence consuming the space. The shadows around it spread across the floor, reaching for me. My body shook as I tried to move, to fight, but the weight of the truth held me in place. The thing loomed over me, its burning eyes boring into mine. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, and for a moment, I thought it would crush me. Then it stopped. The air shifted, the room stilled, and the shadows receded. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into smoke that seeped into the walls. The silence returned, heavier than before, and the only sound left was my ragged breathing. I turned toward the door, the jagged metal still on the floor behind me. The knob turned easily, and the door creaked open. The air outside was cold and sharp, but it was real. I stepped out of the house, my legs unsteady, and walked down the street without looking back. When I reached my apartment, the note was waiting for me on the table. The words had changed, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. "It's your turn now. Finish it."